Good evening and welcome to the BS and Beer Show, where we spread BS and have fun doing it. Tonight's topic is how to design a high-performance home step-by-step, the Pretty Good House approach. So this will be a multi-part presentation. I'll start off talking about why you might want to build a high-performance house, which we call a pretty good house. And then go through sort of a process on how to design a pretty good house, and then that will lead into Bob's presentation showing an excellent example of putting this into practice on a really nice house. So what is a high performance house? And don't worry, I won't be just reading slides this whole presentation, but the first few are more word based rather than picture based. What is a high performance house? It's not really a clearly defined term. Basically, using less energy is not the only thing that goes into a high performance home. That's certainly one important aspect, but there are lots of things that we think belong in a high performance house. So starting off, I'll talk a little bit about what is not a high performance house. So presenting the pretty bad house. A pretty bad house should consist of ugly, awkward, and unused spaces and details inside and out. It should use a lot of energy and just to make it sort of comfortable. It should be unhealthy and make you depressed to live in. It should require high levels of maintenance, repair, and replacement over time, preferably with synthetic materials that aren't actually low maintenance, even though that's how they're advertised. Pretty bad house should create a lot of waste and pollution, and it should have no relationship to the site or the outdoors. That sounds pretty absurd, right? Who would want a house like that? Well, that's compared to a high performance house, that's what a conventional house looks like. The vast majority of new and existing houses have mismatched, redundant, or poorly designed systems. They're larger and more complicated than they need to be. They certainly cost more to operate than necessary. They have poor indoor air quality, of course, a big deal these days with COVID, leading to health and then also building durability problems. They don't necessarily do anything to support the local economy or local ecosystems, not particularly resilient or durable, and have little aesthetic merit. There are programs that try to improve this. Actually, even the IRC building codes get better every 3 years. The 2018 release is not a bad house. I wouldn't quite call it a pretty good house, but it's getting closer. Programs like Passive House, really set a high bar for energy use and indoor air quality. It's hard to get better than Passive House in those areas, but Passive House doesn't really care about any of the other aspects of a high performance house. LEED has been a real leadership program, and it's pretty comprehensive, but it doesn't set a particularly difficult level for energy, and it has some other issues. Energy Star helps on energy. The Living Building Challenge sets amazing goals for everything. If we could all build Living Building Challenge houses, we'd be all set, but it's so difficult to reach that standard that very few buildings are reaching it. So these programs all have use. A lot of them have good training programs, which we don't have with the Pretty Good House approach. But these programs, have been around for years and years, and they have not achieved mass adoption yet. So what should we do? So introducing the Pretty Good House. This is a logo that Bob actually designed, our new logo, Bob's new logo. This is our website, which most of the content I wrote, and Bob put it together and added some more stuff, prettygoodhouse.org. You'll find resources there, and then also links to other stuff. It's a work in progress for sure, but it's a place to start. Before I get into the Pretty Good House, I can't really talk about the Pretty Good House without talking about how it started. It started about 10 years ago in Portland, Maine. A group of building professionals started getting together monthly to talk about issues in building science. Dan Colbert was one of the founders, and he moderates it. Steve Constantino owns Performance Building Supply and hosts it. After getting together for a couple of years and talking about various topics, Dan came in and he was working on, I think, his second lead house, and Passive House was gaining ground. And Dan acknowledged the good aspects, but just found that the whole process was expensive. The consultants are expensive, and you have to jump through some arbitrary hoops, and it's hard to get owner buy-in to the point where you often have the consultants actually paying for certification. So that's kind of a mark of a program that may have some issues. So Dan said, he wants to do better than building code, but he doesn't want to go all the way to passive house or deal with leads. So so we just brainstormed what would make a good house, and then we brainstormed names, and it stuck on Pretty Good House. I wrote a blog post about our discussion on Green Building Advisor, and that's how the Pretty Good House started. And then a few years later, I moved away from Portland and started my own local discussion group at a brewery and named it BS and Beer. When COVID hit earlier this year, we took it to Zoom with Emily Martram and Travis Brungart. And so now we broadcast nationally every week on Thursdays. And Kylie Jacques of Green Building Advisor is also our co-host. And it's great if you want to tune in, but we really started it sort of as a way to model how you might do local discussion groups. And we now have discussion groups all over the country and one in Australia. Feel free to use the name BS and Beer or any variation. Actually, Bill's in New Orleans is BS and Red Beans. It's just gearing up to start. So start your own group. You can find some tips on our website or message me directly. So that's discussion groups. Back to the Pretty Good House. What is the Pretty Good House? It is an approach. The Pretty Good House approach is a framework to guide focus toward the core issues that should be front and center when designing and building any high quality home or renovation. So I should also say this is all the articles and presentations in the past I've done on the Pretty Good House are the result of group effort. This is me holding up and trying to rethink how can we package everything that everybody has crowdsourced over the last 10 years into something that's useful. So this is a work in progress. I welcome any feedback on how to make it more useful. The idea is for this to be a useful place for builders, architects, or homeowners to go to find a framework on what constitutes a good house. So we'll start off with the Pretty Good House rules. These are things that are universally applicable. You have to consider all 9 of these things if you want to say you have a pretty good house. So first off, consider the house as a system. Besides, cars. Actually, the only thing you own that's more complicated than your house may be your car, and that's debatable because there's so much going on in a house, and everything impacts everything else. Comfort drives a lot of this, which is determined by glazing and the envelope, and that's driven by the sun. Airtightness is also impacted, which has to do with mechanical controls, and the result of mechanical controls can create pollution and cost. Durability is important, and moisture can really wreak havoc on all of that. And so you need to get all of these different things in balance, and you can't just trade them out at will. A house built in the 1850s or 1950s is a simpler thing, but it does not have the energy performance or comfort levels of a new high performance house. So the better performance you want. It doesn't mean the house needs to have a lot of mechanical things, but it means the house itself is a complicated system. Number 2 in the Pretty Good House rules is build no larger than necessary. You probably know about Sarah Suzenka's Not So Big House book series, and that's kind of the idea here. When we brainstormed things, we've come up with these metrics. These days with COVID and people working from home and trying to, kids doing school from home, maybe these numbers need to expand a little bit. But on the other hand, I'm designing an ADU now that's 600 square feet for one person. That's plenty of space. My wife and I, just the 2 of us, live in 1,400 square feet. That's more than enough space. The national average occupancy for a house is 2.5 people, and just over 2,600 square feet. It's come down a little bit from this data, but it's around 2,600 square feet for 2.5 occupants. If you averaged out the PGH recommendations, you're at about 1,600. So somewhere in between there is a reasonable target if you happen to have 2.5 occupants in your house. If you want to break it down to single occupants, one person gets 600 to 1,000, but every time you add a person, you don't add a kitchen, you don't add a dining room. So each additional person gets fewer and fewer additional square feet versus the national average of a little over 1,000 per person. Pretty Good House rule number 3, build simply. At the top, that's actually a really beautiful house in Hollowell, Maine. I recently designed a carriage house, so I got to know this house well because I was designing a carriage house that had to look correct next to this, so I got to know all of the details. The owner's a friend of mine. It's a beautiful house. I have nothing against this house whatsoever. It is not a simple house. He basically redoes one facade each year. He goes around and around this house and just fixes up and repaints and replaces wrought on one facade a year. And if that's your idea of a good time, good for you. And I can also say this isn't particularly energy efficient. He's doing his best as he remodels it. But a good example of a pretty good house is on the bottom. An architect friend of mine and Bob's is Emily Mottram. This is a nice, simple, rectilinear farmhouse. That's a nice, simple house. Simple doesn't mean boring. It just means simple. A pretty good house makes energy improvements until they stop making sense. Where is that point? It depends on the project. I use energy modeling to try to find the right spot. When we brainstormed ideas, we also borrowed, for at least the zone 6 cold climate, we used some performance numbers from Joe Stebrick, which also happened to match Harold Orr's recommendation to take your heating degree days and divide by 180 to get your ideal wall insulation, or divide by 150 to get your ideal roof insulation for high performance homes. Those are good starting points. Using energy modeling, I actually often find that a little bit under those numbers works well when you're looking at actual costs, but it depends on the assemblies and the builder. So really every project is different, but the idea is keep making energy improvements until they stop making sense. A pretty good house has to prioritize good indoor air quality. This seems simple, but it's actually a big jump from conventional homes. You really need a kitchen range exhaust that exhausts to the outdoors. That's tough if you're going for a passive house, but and it's true, even though code only requires it for gas stoves, more recent research really shows that cooking just puts an incredible amount of particulate pollution into the indoor air. So you really want to get that outside as quickly as possible. You don't necessarily need a 1200 CFM Viking, but you could use that if you wanted to. Bathrooms make a lot of moisture, which can be nice when you're showering, but it's not good for your house. So you want to get the bathroom air out. You really need a whole house ventilation strategy of some sort. This is a high-end Zender, either HRV or ERV, Comfort 350. It's a good unit. There are other options. The idea is indoor air quality is important. Pretty good house rule is to support your local economy. This can take a lot of different shapes. One is, build or buy a house to renovate that's near a city center or village center, so you have goods and services nearby. If you can work from home, that's great, but and if you grow your own food, that's great, but you still need all the other goods and services. And so the closer you are to existing infrastructure, the better. Shopping at your local farmers market, buying local materials, using local labor. Those are all ways to support your local economy. Support your local and global ecosystems. This is sort of expanding on what I showed in the insight session. So this is showing the building operations and construction together constitute almost 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The embodied carbon, the embodied carbon we use really matters. On a 10-year scale, embodied carbon, has a much bigger impact than operating carbon. Carbon is only one aspect of that, so that's a global ecosystem thing to consider. There are plenty of others. You may not be worried about the polar bears, but just coincidentally, the father of the Pretty Good House standard, Dan Colbert, his sister is Elizabeth Colbert, and she wrote a book called The Sixth Extinction. It's a depressing but great book explaining how we're in the middle of the 6 great species die-off the Earth's history, and that's largely because of things we're doing. The actions we take matter, and we need to be responsible. On a local scale, don't pollute your water. Don't grow any more lawns than you have to, or use weed killers. Just think about the ecosystem as you're building. In a pretty good house, you want to prioritize durable and resilient assemblies. You may or may not be subject to floods like this or wildfires. You may have other issues to deal with, but just you need to understand what your assemblies are. I recently consulted on a project with spray foam, 2 years old, and I just got an email from the builder today that they're not the original builder, the builder who came in after 2 years to rebuild the house because it was riddled with mold due to some poor detailing and an inability to dry. So just it depends what your local issues are, what constitutes durable and resilient, but your average code built house or worse than code is not necessarily durable or resilient. The final rule is design homes with aesthetic appeal. And that of course can vary, but this is a house that Bob designed. It looks traditional, could easily be 150 years old, but it happens to be a nearly new house that meets all of the Pretty Good House metrics. This is another house that Bob designed that he'll talk about next. Very different aesthetic. One or the other probably appeals to you more. Neither one is going to appeal to everybody, but the idea is to design something that has broad appeal. Buildings that are attractive and nice to live in are loved and maintained and are much more likely to last a long time. Another example of a farmhouse from Emily Mottram, then another modern house by Chris Briley of Bryburn Architecture. He's been a longtime Pretty Good House team member. So more lists. I'm sorry, I'll get through these next lists and then we can turn it over to Bob to show a bunch of pretty pictures and talk about the process in real time. But so next up are the Pretty Good House Guideposts. So a few years, Chris Briley and Dan Colbert and Steve Constantino and I were planning to write a book about the Pretty Good House. And so we met and came up with a table of contents and some of the things we'd want to talk about. And then I mapped it out as sort of a roadmap or decision tree. And the idea was sort of treat it in the order in which you would design a house, that these are the big things to think about, and the orange dots, and then the little green dots are sort of all the associated things. And we were going to tie them all together, that these go with this and everything else. A few people look at this and say, wow. Most people look at it and say, whoa, that's way too much information to digest. If you're a designer or a builder, this is just a fraction of the things you need to understand or know, but for your average homeowner, this is overwhelming. And then another problem with this is I heard from a friend of mine, he asked, why are all your blobs brown? He turns out to be colorblind. So I picked the exact worst colors for a colorblind person. So the roadmap was a good idea, but let's not use that. Near where I live here in Maine, this is a signpost. I live adjacent to China. These are all towns in Maine. I live in Palermo, which happens to be the capital of Sicily as well. So the idea is use this as a guidepost. So here's the Pretty Good House Guidepost, things we want to think about as we're designing and building as we're planning any high performance house. We need to think about economics, the team, the climate and ecosystems, regulation and verification, and owner-occupant considerations. So if we take that and just keep those in mind, this is a new idea for a roadmap, more of a board game format. So you start down in the corner, you think through the architectural design and then structure and finishes, and you work through envelope and windows and mechanical controls and energy and lighting. And at the end of the road, you have a nice little Pretty Good House. Any of you who have been through this process before know that the real process looks a lot more like this. This is sort of the Dennis the Menace approach. And so I'm sorry if you're expecting a literal step-by-step approach. This is the step-by-step approach that you step all over the place and back and forth. You need to follow all these steps, but you don't necessarily need to follow them in order. In fact, it never happens in order. Just these are the things that you need to be concerned with, or you need somebody on your team who understands all of these things and how they relate if you want a good high performance house. So we're working down through the specifics on the guideposts, the guiding concepts. One is economics. The graph at the top shows, down on the bottom left, with zero expenditures, you have zero performance. You spend a little money and you get a little performance, and that's your typical existing house. You spend more money, you get better performance, and somewhere in there is a code minimum house. You keep going, and eventually you keep putting in enough effort and spending enough money. Eventually, you'll reach or succeed passive house. Somewhere on that scale is where it stops making sense to spend money on energy improvements. Wherever that point is, it's somewhere above code minimum. It may be all the way to passive house, it may be above passive house, but wherever that inflection point is the pretty good house intersection. Of course, economics has more to do with than just energy. It's just energy is often the one where we're worried about or we're having to fight for. You keep making energy improvements, you can reduce your mechanical systems, and you get a more comfortable house with lower monthly bills. The lower monthly bills means we have more money to put into a mortgage to have nicer everything else. So just it's all tied together. As far as I know, the pretty good house is the only standard that even considers economics. Passive house does a little bit, but with pretty good house, it's really a guiding concept is balancing expenditures and gains. The second guiding concept is the team. Every project is a three-legged stool. One leg is design, one leg is construction, one leg is the client, who's also usually the one responsible for funding, at least any custom project. On a lot of projects, one person or entity may be responsible for more than one of these legs. Even if you're responsible for all three, if you're a developer, designing and building your own project, you still need to keep all three of these legs balanced. Often one of these gets shortchanged. Often it's design, but if you want a good project, you need to invest in design. You need to invest in good construction with a good builder. And you need a client who's willing to do something that's a little different from what their neighbors do. And then you have all the associated team members. Each of these team members have their whole posse of people to help them. If a leg gets cut short, then the project slides off the stool. If I was more clever, I would do a nice little Chris Magwood animation, but that didn't happen. Climate and ecosystem. So the first thing is to understand where you are in the world in terms of climate. Bob and I are both in zone 6, which is the sort of teal blue near the top. We both work in bordering zone 5. I'll occasionally do some consulting in zone 4, but that's really getting out of my comfort zone because just everything is different in zone 4 than it is in zone 6. So you need to understand where you are in terms of, hot versus cold, wet versus dry. Then also your microclimates. Are you on a south-facing hillside? Are you in the middle of a city? Do you have a great view to the north that you just really have to take advantage of and need to deal with? It doesn't basically just understand the environmental things working on your house, and then also understand how what you're doing impacts ecosystems. I know there's a little overlap here with one of the pretty good house rules. I need to work on that, but essentially it's okay to say it twice because it's that important. The next pretty good house guidepost is regulation and verification. So at bare minimum, this means at least meeting building codes. The IRC 2018 is a pretty decent house in most respects. There are usually financial paybacks to go better than their energy recommendations, but in terms of structure and other things, it's a decent starting point. When you're building, use the red door of truth to find out where you are on energy, not just to check off some box, but because when you measure something, you get better. It's the new craftsmanship is getting good at these energy details, and the only way to get good is to measure what you're doing. I don't have a picture of it, but another important aspect to this is commissioning. Mechanical systems, especially things like mini split heating and any balanced ventilation system needs to be checked and adjusted after construction. They're not plug and play, even if they say they are. So you need to commission your systems. If you want to go beyond that, Pretty Good House is not anti-passive house or anti-LEED. Those are great programs. I encourage using them. I'm passive house trained, and I use what I learned there pretty much every day. Every architect or designer I know or builder I know who's passive house trained uses what they learned there. So I highly encourage the training. I think that's maybe the best thing that they do. And that's part of that whole approach. If you want to go through with certification, then that verifies that what you think is true. With a Pretty Good House. If you think you met the rules, send Dan Colbert $50 and he'll send you a sticker. We're not quite at the same level of verification. Owner-occupant influence. This one's a little hard to describe, but the main thing here, I think, is that every house should have an owner's manual of some sort. It may not be the same one you use for your toaster, but if your toaster has an owner's manual, it shouldn't your house. A lot of people put it on a thumb drive or a CD or just or put it online, but it's owner's manuals for all the parts and pieces you're using. It's a home maintenance schedule, maybe a checklist of things to do or what to do if something happens. So that's one end of owner-occupant influence. Another that's not pictured here is the KISS strategy of just keep it simple. We can design some very complicated, clever systems that work great if you understand how to use them. But your average homeowner, and even if you build the house for a homeowner who understands them, at some point the house will move to somebody else, and you want to understand and you want to make sure that future owners know how to operate their house. A related concept here is to, in order to spread the word on why you'd want to build Pretty Good or other high performance houses, turn your clients into fans. This is Eric, writes a blog on Green Building Advisor about his experience designing and building a passive house. Get clients excited, make them into salespeople. Then moving on to building elements. So this is sort of part 2 of the guideposts. These are the things that a lot of these will be regionally specific or locally specific. These are things that I definitely would suggest talking about in your local building science discussion group, in your local BS and Beer group, what this means for you locally. Any house needs architectural design of some sort. But in a Pretty Good house, you want to put some effort into it. You don't necessarily need to hire a licensed architect, but that's a good place to start. But just that's everything from carefully siting the house, meaning where does it sit on the site in relation to the world, what does the exterior look like, how does it relate to its neighbors. On the interior, it's what is the layout, is there how does the net, how is it lit, how do rooms flow together, just all of that stuff that you probably think an architect does, and you don't realize they also do all of these other things. That's what architectural design is. The next building element that's critical are the 4 control layers. Hopefully most of you know the control layers, but you may not know this new version. Mark Pollard at Thompson Johnson Woodworks recommended this, and I think it's a great idea. I don't have any illusions we're going to get people to stop saying house wrap or WRB, but I really like the consistency. That in order of importance, we have a WCL, that's the water control layer. We have the ACL, the air control layer. We have the vapor control layer and the thermal control layer. Those are 4 layers. They're all important. You need them all on every single house, but there's no sense even worrying about thermal control until you have water control figured out. And this will change depending on where you are. Where we need these things in a northern climate or even on different assemblies in our climate is different from what you would need in Florida or Seattle. Structure and finishes. This is basically all the bones of the house and the skin. So the foundation, floors, walls, roof, and then things like decks. So it's, what's holding up the house, what are you looking at on the interior, what are you looking at on the exterior, and how do all those relate to everything else you're worrying about on the house. A critical part of the envelope are windows and doors. In a Pretty Good house, you don't necessarily need a triple glaze high performance European window like the macro win on the top right from Performance Building Supply. That will certainly get you excellent performance right off the bat. Or the top left is Logic Window by Pinnacle Window Solutions. Both of those are based in Maine. Bottom left, I believe, is it's a house I designed. I think it's the last house in the US that had Intus windows before they pulled out of the residential market. Those are all excellent triple glaze European or European style windows. The Logic are built in Pennsylvania. But they're not always critical. Smaller windows, or if you're not in a zone 6 or 7 climate, there's a good chance you don't really need triple glazing. The bottom right is a renovation. It's a garage conversion attached to a house that's not high performance. We use double glazed Marvin Elevates. They're appropriate for the situation. I would still call that pretty good. You also want to control, what are your, understand your numbers. What's the solar heat gain coefficient? What's the U value or U factor? Moving on with building elements, we have materials. Where are they from? How do they affect your health? What's their carbon footprint? How will they last? What kind of maintenance will they need? Um, Environmental controls, you might call these mechanical systems, but sometimes they're not very mechanical. So heating, cooling, ventilation, dehumidification, these are all different ways to accomplish it, but they're all things that need to be considered and understood. And they should be understood early on. Most projects in the past I've been involved on, sort of we do everything, we do all the architectural design, and then we turn all these controls over to the HVAC contractor. There are some very good HVAC contractors out there, but it's really stuff that builders and architects and other designers should have a more solid understanding of than they typically do. The last of the building elements is energy and lighting. So on the energy front, a pretty good house ideally would be net zero. The house on the bottom is actually net positive. They use the extra to power their electric cars. If you can't quite swing PV panels, then at least make it net zero ready. Or if you're in a place that allows community solar, I think that's an excellent way to free you up on the architectural design is buy into a community solar program, or other renewable energy. It's just, PV is the simplest way. Top left is low profile LED recessed lights are just amazing and super flexible and forgiving. Even with LEDs, it's still nice to think about daylighting. It's less of an energy issue now with LEDs, but it's still there's nothing like the quality of light when you have natural daylight. So that is the new Pretty Good House step-by-step guide. For more information, check out prettygoodhouse.org. Coming right up, Bob will walk you through an excellent example of how all this actually works in practice.
Okay, here I am. Good job, Mike. Does everybody hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Good job. That was really smooth, and I won't be as smooth, but I have pretty pictures, so that's okay. Let me make sure I know how to run the slides here. Good. I'm good. Okay, so I'm Bob Swinburne. I've been an architect in Vermont for the past 15 years, doing mostly high-performance homes and assorted smaller projects. For a dozen years before that, I was a carpenter, actually, fresh out of architecture school, and a building designer. Then I got my license in 2005. So I do a lot of projects at the residential scale and smaller. So I get a lot of attention for the Fern House, which is on my own property. And it's simply a screen pavilion in the woods. It's also been rebuilt in many places around the world, but we're here for Pretty Good House. So this is the one you saw a little while ago in Mike's presentation. And this is more aesthetically conservative than the project I'm going to go over in this presentation because it needed to fit into an existing neighborhood. And an important aspect of the Pretty Good House approach is context. So we pushed it a bit on this one so that people either think it's a renovation and it's been there a long time, or if they have a more discerning eye, they can see that it's actually a more modernist interpretation of a typical New England in-town home. And I think the lesson here, for me anyway, is that good design doesn't have to hide in its context. This house fits in, but when you walk down the street, you do notice it. It's clear and simple compared to other houses on the street. So, the notion that it really has to hide and fit in, and, I don't necessarily believe that. So I'm reading some notes here, because I'm not all that smooth. To introduce the project, I'm going to first introduce the site. This is the site as I first saw it the very first day, along with a client brief. So the client had a large home at the end of a dirt road that was a ways out of town with extensive gardens and animals, and she wanted something easier to take care of, and really something that would take care of her in her retirement years. So aging in place issues were front and center. I'm just going to scroll through some photos here. Aging in place issues were front and center, as they always should be, really, because I'm not just designing for the current client, but for people who will be living in this house for perhaps centuries, really. So she had purchased 5 acres close to the center of a small Vermont town. So she's within a mile of the co-op and a library. The land was managed sugar bush with little underbrush. It had a very strong aesthetic. Lines and shadows were just providing very, very strong patterns, especially on the snow. And this shows up later in the design, as you'll see. I had the idea of a humble chapel in the woods, something that would age in place along with the client, really. Something dark and shaggy on the outside, but clean and bright and pure on the inside. And we held on to that vision all the way through, I think. We'll follow through that. Wood quickly came to the fore as an issue, not just a house in the woods, but the realization that I could really push forward the idea of working with a local mill and maximize the use of local wood, as opposed to the greenfield house I showed before. I had a lot more freedom to play with this project. The context was just much more open. And this is the finished house through the trees. The client had worked with an architect before, and that's interesting in that when I work with people who have prior experience, it provides a frame of reference for the client and hopefully an appreciation of the process I try to set up. And so when I start a new project, I prefer to bring a builder in early in the design process so they can provide pricing and detailing help. And so more importantly, they can start to develop a relationship with the client before construction. This is the beginning of the collaborative process, and it does require a pre-construction agreement, which has been mentioned before in this summit. Let's see. This is a page off my own website with a number of people, builders, suppliers, etc., that I like to work with on a regular basis, and each one of these little buttons is hot linked to their own website. So, the setting up the collaborative process starts, right at the beginning and even before the beginning on the website. When I'm considering a builder for a specific project, I have to think about really not just their abilities and qualifications, but how their personality will mesh with the client, because I'm setting up a relationship. It's like matchmaking. And I'm looking also for a builder who wants more than a set of plans that they may or may not follow. I'm really looking for somebody who is happy and excited to engage in the design process with enthusiasm for my role and want to be part of the design team, just as later on I want to be part of the project as it's being constructed, because there's no cutoff between design and construction. It's one continuous dance, one continuous flow. So back to a little more history of how we chose the builder for this project, which is also very related to my own history. So after college, I went to work for Mindell and Morse Builders as a carpenter and a designer, and they had just recently had a super insulated Larson Truss house in the 1994 Fine Homebuilding annual issue of houses, and I think it was designed by Jim Young. Eventually, as I moved on, became licensed and built my own practice, I continued to do projects with Mindell and Morse. And a few years ago, Steve Mindell and Jonathan Morse, hi guys, handed the business off to Josh Engel and Garo Dolphus, also, hi guys. And so I have a photograph of Garo. That's a rarity. So I had to set up a blind in the front yard, and there's a tripwire, which you can't really see, but I got a photo of him after a few hours. So a really cool circular thing here is that here we are today presenting a Mindell and Morse project with super insulation and Larson trusses at a Fine Homebuilding Summit. I just think that's kind of cool. Garo says hi in the chat. So the design process, this is, a typical architect sketch. You might show a client early on. Let me just scroll through here. I'm losing my control of the slides here. And the important part here is that this wasn't just me sitting at the table with the client, but Garo was sitting there too when I presented this. He had already seen what I was working on and provided some feedback. So, I mean, that was immensely helpful. The process was really one of simplification for this whole house all the way through. I mean, there are probably more complicated details than Garo would probably chew me out for not mentioning, but we used a lot of imagery inside and out to stay true to the original nature of the project, that, you know, the dark and shaggy on the outside and bright clean on the inside. And to test that vision, we did a lot of imagery. And you can see there's sort of this process of paring down to the point where we got to 4 walls and a roof. That simple. And on the inside, you know, we're starting to explore that notion of a light-filled chapel in the woods. So when the builder is a part of the design team, they often develop that level of passion for the design, not just the construction, and that really helps me as an architect moving forward through construction to convey what is important about the design, so things don't get lost, things don't get run over. So this all was happening simultaneously with Garo and I figuring out construction methodology. And I had some ideas I wanted to try, and Mindell and Morse is very comfortable with a variety of methodologies, from double stud to timber framing to Larson truss type construction. And so the early design sketches are developed based on conversations with the builder, but still in a fairly abstract fashion at this point. And we gradually work into a real construction methodology approach that, when it's more formalized, such as here, this point represents a fair amount of back and forth between myself and the builder. And for this project, we wanted a system, a methodology system that considered best practice building science, of course, but was really set up to maximize local wood, thereby reducing carbon footprint. And starting at the bottom, you know, we knew we wanted to go with a frost protected shallow foundation, and there was a lot of ledge on this site, and a full basement would have been unnecessary and very expensive. So we went with warm form. I had wanted to try that system out, and we actually drove to another project that was under construction with the warm form, and we came back pretty convinced. What we did here was a little different. We did the perimeter out of warm form, but the field of the foam, you know, the stuff in the center under the slab, was actually recycled foam. It probably came from the roof of a large commercial project. It didn't necessarily save money, but, you know, it's like less production, less carbon in the atmosphere. It you know, stood for our values a little bit. So the next slides show a 2x6 perimeter wall forming a simple rectangle with deep floor trusses forming the roof structure. You know, as simple as that. That's all the structure, really. All additions to this are for finishes and extra insulation. I like this slide because it really shows the integration of the air sealing strategy at the framing phase, which is when I was carpentering way back in the 90s. You know, we didn't think of that, but carpenters and framers nowadays in the high performance building world really have to be on top of their game. So here they're thinking through the process, and they're setting themselves up for a very simple and successful air barrier. At the very least, it shows they were looking at the drawings, so that's cool. And quite a few local builders prefer board sheathing. I mean, this is Vermont, we have a lot of wood. So board sheathing provides a very durable and vapor open structural sheathing. And on this project, there was very little waste. With the board sheathing, there is essentially no waste. They put bins of cutoffs at the end of the driveway, and people hauled them off for kindling. And overall, there was never a dumpster on this project. We didn't quite get down to 3 bags of trash for sure, but very, very little waste and no dumpster. I'm not going to go deep into construction methodology, but this is, for those unfamiliar, is a basic Larson truss. It's actually simplified from a lot of Larson trusses. And a Larson truss is a way of gaining exterior insulation, getting that thick blanket around your building with minimal material and, being able to use cellulose or some sort of fiber insulation material. And even you can see the use of waste here. There's the gussets for the Larson trusses were cutoffs and leftovers from the Advantech subfloor in many cases. A neat little trick that we figured out here is that if we ran the roof trusses long, we could actually use them for layout and support for the Larson truss. So it's a nice little discovery that Garo and I made before we actually started framing, and it worked out quite well. So at about this stage, we had an open house as part of a local community house tour. And this happened before installation when people could see all the framing and really understand how it went together. And so this is part of community engagement and education, which is a really important aspect of the Pretty Good House approach. And at the open house, it was really interesting to listen to Garo and Josh describe not only the simplicity of this system, but to be able to talk through design issues with a high level of expertise and enthusiasm. And so this is a double-sided flyer I had made up so that people touring the house could walk around, look at the walls, look at the construction drawing and see how it was working there, but also flip it over and see the overall vision of the house long before it was finished. The next section is more about wood. I mentioned wood really came to the fore in this project early on. So when I was in high school, I worked in a small sawmill, and I learned a few things about wood. So hemlock, which this is what you're seeing here, is hard and heavy and holds up to the elements better than pine. And pine is used a lot in New England as siding, often without any finish. And when I started seeing and using rain screen details, I realized that might be a way to use local hemlock and specify it with no finish. The reasoning being that if any of these boards start to show decay, you can just take them off. They're not lapped or anything. It's an open gap rain screen. So you can take them off, toss them in the bushes where they can decompose. It's also relatively inexpensive and has low labor costs. But this is my first experiment with using hemlock as siding, and I had to tell the client, this is an experiment. I have no idea if this is really going to work, but it turned out to be great. And I'm so grateful to have a client who was willing to let me experiment a bit. And a more recent project, so I've used it a bunch of times over the past decade or so. This is a more recent project where the builder used some hemlock that had been sticked and stacked in the field for a while. You can see those marks, and it's an incredibly beautiful wood for the exterior of a building. And so in putting these slides together, I realized that this project is as much about the sawyer who provided all this wood. So I wanted to grab a picture of him here. So John harvested and milled cherry for the stair treads, locust, black locust for the decking, sugar maple for the flooring, for the windowsills. That all came off the site. The hemlock for the siding and the pine for sheathing were local as well and from his mill, but not directly off the site. So the following images, I'm showing how we used the wood on this project, and we're essentially having fun here. I mean, you can see how we use the siding to reflect the nature of the surrounding forest. The upper siding, which will turn gray, has fins, which are simply boards turned sideways to create strong shadow lines and really relate to the verticality of the forest around it. In the lower rafter tails, I realized this after the fact. It didn't really show up in the modeling, obviously, to me, but they provide a very staccato rhythm. So the house developed this musical quality to it, which was really fun to see revealed as the house was built. A bit of a close-up of that hemlock siding, and it's essentially an open gap rain screen system with the mentality that we're assuming this wood is going to get wet, and how fast can it dry out? And if something goes bad, how easily can it get replaced? So stylistically, this is modern, but more specifically, I like to call it carpenter modern. So there's this modernist idea, or maybe it's my modernist idea, that what you do works for the site, for the client, for the materials, the program, the microclimate, the good of the planet, the good of the community. And so detailing and use of materials, there's a lot of logic and what makes sense. Placement of size and sizes of windows are what makes sense. I call it carpenter modern because I see this mentality all around me in structures people create for themselves, whether woodsheds or barns. And I'm just taking this mentality a step further. So you start to see that carpenter modern aesthetic in the carport. The idea that here is that we don't need to tightly close in this space. We should let it breathe a bit like you would a woodshed. There's also the notion of light filtering through the aged siding in an old barn or a tobacco barn to the south of here in Connecticut. And the carport, again, clarity of design and simplicity of design. The carport becomes a woodshed, becomes a porch, and it reads as one cohesive piece rather than having a separate language for the carport and storage area and porch. You know, we're really, really pushing the idea of simplicity through here. And you can start to see there's the locust decking, and back under the cover of the porch, it hasn't really turned color yet. Here it's turning gray, and all the siding that you see to the right on this photo will turn gray over time and become a rough and shaggy exterior with a pure and light-filled interior. So on the inside, there's this real emphasis on the nature of the thick protective shell. And so the interior wall is distinguished from the shell of the house with plywood cladding, which also emphasizes the simplicity of the form. The kitchen is clear and simple and definitely pretty good house sized. And my favorite part is that there's a door directly off the kitchen to a back stoop, you know, very functional in an old fashioned sort of way where, you know, you get stuff out of the garden, you bring it here to the back porch, shell the peas, shuck the corn, wash the dog. There's an outdoor shower there. And bring it into the kitchen and process it. And, you know, and then stuff that stays outside either goes off to the chickens or to the compost pile. So it's this sort of old New England idea brought into a very modern house. The counters are Rich Light, which is a pressed paper product, which is kind of fun to work with. What I'm showing with this slide is that I played with very careful alignments, such as the relationship of the counter to the window. This layer of care in detailing really provides a visual calmness, which really supports the calmness and serenity of the whole house. And I'm realizing just how important this is to design, but it takes a lot of detailing and careful planning and communication to pull it off. You know, if the builders were not totally on board with this detail, it probably wouldn't have happened, or it would have been messed up in a little way, and I the architect, would have gotten all excited. But the builders took it a step further, and the house is full of little examples of careful detailing and alignments that the builders slipped in. And it's fun as an architect to walk through the house and see, you know, the level of attachment that the crew have for this house. Another aspect of this house, there on the left is an actual rendering, and on the right is the stair. It was sort of a collaboration between myself and Flywheel Industrial Arts. And it's raw steel, perforated metal mesh for guards and risers, and the cherry from John for treads. Installation is plug and play, and last well beyond the life of this house. So there's this nature of considering what is the end of span. What happens to this house in 300 years? What parts get reused, what parts compost, and designing and thinking about what you put into a building with that mentality, I think, is an important part of the Pretty Good House approach as well. Design-wise, well, you can see also there's some sugar maple flooring there and semi-local slate. Design-wise, going up the stair is quite an experience. The whole house lives on one level and is very accessible, but the stairs lead up to a loft area it's fairly open, and it's really more of a treehouse. So going up the stairs is like climbing a ladder into a treehouse. I really like pushing that experiential level in design. Likewise, the hearth, it's sort of a modernist interpretation of an ingle nook. The notion that on a dark, stormy night, you make a fire in the stove and you settle in with a book, and you're in this dark puddle of light while the storm rages on outside, and you're warm and cozy. So that, again, that experiential aspect of design, as opposed to the other side of that room is this huge window that really, it's great for when it's been 10 degrees all week and you haven't really been able to get outside and you're going stir crazy. You do have, the ability to do a little sun worshiping in that big window. I find that with thick walls, it becomes very important not to simply have a bunch of individual windows, but to really use the windows to create a variety of experiences. And the site is fairly well shaded, so that doesn't get a lot of heat gain in the winter. And just another shot of the porch and the continuation of that slatted wall that forms the carport all the way through to the porch. And there's a shot of the whole thing. So that long wall, it's both a wall of protection and engagement, really. The porch is created within this wall serves a similar but more site-specific function to the more traditional porch on the Greenfield house that you saw earlier, but they're fundamentally the same on a deeper level. We worked with Efficiency Vermont on this project, as we do on most projects. They provide an amazing level of building science support, and unbeknownst to the client, Garrow and I decided to go for full passive house certification on this project. And so the certifications are not counter to the Pretty Good House idea. I think they're supportive of it. In this case, we were so close to design and detailing of a full passive house that we wanted to find out what it was like to go through that process. So we hired a consultant to handle the numbers and help guide us with decisions. And Efficiency Vermont helped with that as well. So the client is still a bit stunned at what she got. And Garrow is actually building her a fern house on the property. They were up there last week scoping out locations. So I think that's pretty sweet. A little bit of a circular back. That's why I put the fern house in back at the beginning of the presentation. And Garrow and I are on to the next project, which is in framing now. And we learned a lot about detailing, communication, and process with the Sugar Bush house, and generally how to improve how we do things, and just the notion of trying to push that forward, not reinvent the ball in the next, reinvent the wheel on the next project, but really push it forward and move that needle forward. So if there's anything to be taken away from this project and my presentation of it is about the integrated design process. And this project was an exploration of what that can really mean. And part of it is simply being more open to contributions from the various players at an earlier phase of the project. Create more situations where there is a greater possibility of engagement. Look for opportunities, and don't assume that builders aren't interested in design, and seek out, builders seek out architects who want that level of engagement, and architects vice versa seek out builders who really want to be part of the design. So, this is credits. There's a lot of people involved in here, and every one of them had some good influence. Let's see, and that's it. And we have some credits for both Mike and I and Pretty Good House. Take a screenshot, seek us out, and that's it.
Nice house, Bob. Oh, you're muted.
I'm figuring out mic off and video off. And are there any questions?
Yeah, I think Rob's going to come on and feed us some questions, so we can just. I think we can let Bob ask us. Let Rob ask us questions.
Yeah, I'll go through a few. You guys can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Let's see. We've got a bunch of questions. I'll work kind of backwards since it's just going to be easier that way. But how do you like to insulate your cathedral ceilings if you're not using foam?
Mike?
I prefer a vented system using cellulose. I use cellulose insulation wherever I can. Pretty soon, within the next couple of years, we'll probably have wood fiber insulation produced here in Maine, and then I imagine a lot of us in New England will be switching over to straight wood fiber that's not made into paper first. The trick is just to provide a good vent cavity and a place for air intake at the eave, and a place for it to go out at the ridge.
And Bob, I know you probably have information about this maybe on your website, because I've seen some pictures of the house. But how big was that house that we were just talking about through this whole project?
13. Yeah, good point. 1,300 square feet of living area, and so I'm doing inside the walls as opposed, because they're really fat walls. So 1,300 square feet. Okay.
And how about when you include the deck? Do you know that offhand?
I don't know that. When I include the deck, the cost per square foot goes way down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just nice to see all of that outdoor living space, because that's one thing about a lot of these houses that you guys work on, is that you don't think of it as this box that separates people from their environment. It's a transition to their environment around them.
Yeah, and I think that I'm here to show this is an engineered house, but it's also a designed house, and you can have both.
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to add as well, just a couple of things. I mean, at first glance, it looks like a pretty complex house because of the unexpected angles, both in the roof and in the way things are arranged. But if you look at it and plan, it's a rectangle with another slightly off-kilter rectangle. It's a very simple concept. It's just very, very precisely executed. And then in terms of square footage, if you look at the interior, it feels huge on the inside because of these soaring spaces and the long sight lines and the views. And that's all stuff that doesn't just happen. That's something that you need a really good designer or architect to help you create those spaces that make a relatively small space not just feel bigger, but also live bigger than the footprint might indicate.
Thanks. Daniel was asking, where does accessibility and adaptability and aging in place fit into the Pretty Good House concept?
That is, or yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, I think they have to be totally integrated. I mean, it's like if you're designing a new house or building a new house, there's no excuse for not really thoroughly considering accessibility, aging in place, who's going to live here a generation down the road, 10 generations down the road, ideally. It has to be 100% integrated.
Okay, we had another question asking about the shallow overhangs on the back porch. If they're detailed properly, are they still considered less risky? A lot of people worry about, the risk and the value of an overhang is for protecting, especially when you've got wood siding.
Referring to the Sugar Bush house. Yeah, I mean, we have deep overhangs on the carport and outdoor space, not so deep on the main house. And the thinking there is that it's a fairly protected site from wind, but if I do a 1 foot deep overhang, it's going to protect the top foot of the wall. If I do a 2 foot deep, it's going to protect the top 2 feet. And in this case, being in the woods, and in Vermont, we have these long periods of very high humidity. And I was really wanting light and air and sun to hit as much of the siding as possible to really emphasize drying potential of this siding. So I could go on and on. Yep. So there's this notion of, you see New England architecture, the old capes, and they have almost no overhangs. And I think that was because they were very conscious of how fast can this wet building dry out, and an overhang can slow that down. So we just sort of took that mentality towards this building. If it was a different site and a different project, I might have the exact opposite approach, and I often do.
Well, that sort of rolls into another question. Matt was asking about, he says the life cycle of hemlock as a siding, but I'm guessing he's talking more about the durability and lifespan.
Yeah, so when rain screen siding started to be a thing, and we really adopted it fairly early in Vermont, or at least the people I work with, and it became, you look at the old barns with hemlock siding or pine siding that is, sometimes a century old because it dries out so fast if it gets wet. And it's sort of, as opposed to when I was a carpenter and you put the siding tight against the Tyvek, and it really, it could get wet and stay wet. I just saw that, wow, there's a lot of potential here for using different materials in a simpler way. And so it is a bit of an experiment. It's going well so far. I hope there's no big lawsuits in my future.
Okay, we have another question. Mike in the chat had answered Heidi's question about whether it makes more sense to renovate than to build new, and the embodied energy in the existing buildings. You've got a savings with renovation, but what about what are your suggestions for looking at existing housing stock for something that's a practical renovation from that standpoint?
Yeah, I guess I'd say the first thing is to, figure out where you want to live first, and then start looking at what's available, and just essentially the better the bones of the house. A house that doesn't need too many changes, or the fewer changes the house needs, the lower the embodied carbon will be. As an example, I bought an 1830 farmhouse in pretty much original condition because I didn't want to deal with 15 renovations and mistakes at every step of the way. So it means it's an energy hog, but it's in good condition. Another thing to think about would be that try to be flexible on your goals. Sort of identify some big picture things that are important, but don't get too hyper focused on what things have to be. You have to be a little bit flexible when you're renovating. You may not have the perfect kitchen, living, dining arrangement. You may have to compromise a little bit. Connection to city water and sewer is always handy if it's available. Good solar access is actually, that's probably a big one, is good solar access. Anything else, Bob? What am I missing?
No, it sounded pretty good.
No pun intended, or pun intended?
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't think I asked this one already, Bob, but Daniel asked, could you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with the clients and how you work with the clients? Because you're talking about how integrated the process is with the builder and the clients.
Oh, it's really all about communication. Design is secondary. It's 100% communication, and you try to set up the level of communication, the expectation for communication before you even sign the contract. And then ideally, the builder can come in on that level. And if they're really not up to that level of communication, you push them. So in terms of working, in most cases, clients come to me and I match them with a builder. And at this point, I'm collecting builders all over Vermont that I'd love to work with, and some that I have, and many for whom I've actually designed their own homes. And so, yeah, there's pretty pictures, there's sketches, there's all the traditional architecture and design and construction stuff, but it's really 100% communication. Also manage expectations.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about the details you consider when you're talking about aging in place, particularly from an interior perspective?
Yeah. So in the case of this house, I didn't have an ADA manual sitting next to me, but, the notion that you come home in your car and, if you're, in this case, there's even the possibility of having like a live-in home health aide. But, so you try to think about things like that, even if they're not anywhere near in the future. In this case, yeah, you drive in and you could get out of your car into a wheelchair, make it all the way into the house, have a fully open and accessible bathroom, all the way through to the kitchen. The decks are flush with the doors. So it's going quite a ways. There's probably more that I could do. And at some point I'd love to really, study up on what other people are doing. But yeah, so door clearances, bathrooms are huge. In the case of if somebody were in a wheelchair and needed a filter on the Minotaur air exchange unit changed, for instance, that would be an issue because that's up high. So this, like, I just thought of that. There's always more I can think of.
So did this project have any solar? And if not, why not?
It doesn't have solar. We are looking at community solar options. We wanted to minimize how many trees we actually took down, because part of the beauty of the site was being this house in the trees, in the forest. So, and letting it grow back into the forest and really, be kind of hidden away off on a dirt road, but still close to town, as I mentioned.
Robert asked if there's any chance you can talk, at least in rough terms, about the cost of a project like this.
Oh, figure something northward of 300 a square foot if we're just counting finished space, but then you add in porch and carport, that adds a lot of square footage. If I were looking at that really roughly, I might say that exterior space is maybe only, 40-50%. And then I start getting below 300 a square foot.
So talking to your insulation question there earlier, Mike, about not using foam in an attic or in a roof, how do you attain a R49 roof with only cellulose and vented? I guess you're just doing large trusses or rafters.
It depends. I mean, Bob, you used open web trusses, which is one way to do it. Most of my projects don't have cathedral ceilings, so we just do loose blown to our, anywhere from R50 to R80, depending on the situation. When I do cathedral ceilings or vaulted ceilings, I'll often use a parallel cord truss. That's kind of like a scissor truss, but instead of having the weird offset angles, the angles are aligned, which just makes designers' eyes not bleed. And then when it's stick framed, actually what I probably do more often than anything is called a gusseted rafter. So I'll use a structural rafter, usually a 2x10 or a 2x12, and then hang a 2x4 parallel to it below it, using little scraps of wood to connect them. And so doing that you can really adjust the depth of your rafter assembly. I usually do an 18-inch assembly and an 1.5 inch vent space. Code minimum is a 1-inch vent space, but that really doesn't allow enough airflow. So with an 1.5 inch vent space, In an 18-inch cavity, you get 16.5 inches of cellulose, which is R60.
All right. So now I know we mentioned hemlock was used on the siding. Is that on the whole exterior of the house? And could you talk a little bit about the details?
The hemlock siding, as you can still see the slides, right? I'm going back to the slide. Okay.
Yeah.
The hemlock is on the insulated shell of the house. The carport is framed in hemlock, not kiln dried lumber, but actual hemlock from a local mill. It's sheathed with pine, and the slatted wood that you see is actually black painted pine, nothing special. And the decking is black locust, and that's all.
All right.
Yeah.
It's just a new way of using it, so we wanted to try.
Yeah. Well, and just a related note to that, too, is just the idea of using natural materials instead of synthetic. I mean, just like spray foam use is proliferating. Synthetic exteriors are proliferating. People think that they advertise them as zero maintenance. They're not zero maintenance. They require a bleach wash, or they have antimicrobial agents in them or something. And they look good on day one, then they look worse every year after that until they're eventually torn off and thrown away. Whereas if you go with a natural material, like in the Northeast, wood is appropriate if it's done well, but in other parts of the country, you might use brick or stone or adobe. It looks great on day one, and then every day after that, it looks a little bit different. So it's like watching an ocean or clouds change. It's a very natural progression. There is some maintenance, and that after time, if you design it well, like Bob did, yes, some boards will rot, so you pop them out and replace them. If a couple of deck boards rot, you pop them out and replace them, and the deck still looks great and it has this history. Versus putting plastic down everywhere, then it just gets moldy and mildewy, and eventually you tear it off and replace it anyway. So what's the difference? And then just on the design, and it's also understanding how this will change. Like this is a beautiful shot, but because we understand wood, we know that over time the siding is going to go gray. It's going to get this really beautiful mottled look, and there'll be a lot less contrast to the black painted slats. And so just this whole thing is going to change over time, which it's exciting to me. Just I think it gives it a lot more life than if you wrap this in plastic and then it just looks slightly chalky in 10 years. It doesn't have the same appeal.
Yeah, and Bob, you mentioned earlier, the sort of relationship to the vernacular barn type architecture, and it's like there's a pine barn, or maybe it's hemlock, that I've seen in my neighborhood for 20 years, and it's, as long as it's drying out after it gets wet, it looks the same as it did 20 years ago, as far as I can tell.
Exactly.
Somebody asked why you didn't choose to use the popular Shugiban where you did the black there.
Oh yeah, all that open flame probably can't be too good for the environment. Also, I know this sort of looks like Shoshugiban, but no, I'd actually like to try that someday. But it's very labor intensive, so we were cutting costs on this project.
Mike, Clark asked, are there any plans to track the number of pretty good houses across the U.S.? And I guess that's one thing, that all those things like LEED and Passive House have, is that they actually document all those houses. He said he'd love to know how much this concept is gaining traction compared to the other systems. Yeah,
no, there are no plans. I guess eventually we might ask an advantage to the programs that charge you money is that they have things like budgets and time and money to spend on these things. So since we don't, this is all strictly volunteer, we don't have a whole lot of resources to spend on that. I did answer a similar question to somebody recently who just asked how many pretty good houses are built across the country, and I said thousands or possibly tens of thousands. Most of them don't know they have a pretty good house, but there are thousands or tens of thousands out there.
I should add that one of our goals, I think, with the Pretty Good House website is actually to have case studies, such as this, where people can. So, just putting that out there, inviting people to think about putting together a presentation like this that we can then show other people on the Pretty Good House website.
So another question related to the siding or the wood. What sort of maintenance do you anticipate for the hemlock wood siding, or any of the exterior wood?
Yeah, the intention is to minimize maintenance without going into some sort of a synthetic material that claims to last forever. As soon as you paint or stain something, then you have to deal with it. In this case, we did, there's what Garrow say, a stain on the black, which, in terms of if that goes bad, it's not so bad because it's not up high. It's not, there's basically no fine carpentry on the outside of this house. So yeah, like if a piece goes bad, you pull it off, you slap another piece on. You're not worried about fine carpentry. So the notion that this building can age in place and change over time, and that maintenance is not something you necessarily have to call a professional in to take care of.
So are all those details just nailed to furring strips on the rain screen? Is that
exactly? Yep, lots of air right behind that siding.
Sounds good. Well, I don't see any more questions. It's about the time we were planning on wrapping up based on our schedule for the night. So if anybody's got anything last minute thing they want to ask, now's your chance. Otherwise, I want to just thank you guys for your presentation. It was informative and inspiring.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Well, just one quick thing. Armando Cobo emailed me. He's in the chat. He designs houses in the South and Southwest, and just in pretty much the opposite of where Bob and I work, including very, very different labor, different materials, different priorities. And so it's hard to translate like what happened here with an excellent architect, an excellent builder, an excellent client. Like it's hard to translate that into broad applicability to every house. I think the important thing is to pick the sort of, this is one example of sort of an extreme Pretty Good House. And so I'd encourage anybody who thinks that they maybe aren't ready to go to this level, or they're in the part of the country or market where this type of house is not even possible, to just go back to the Pretty Good House concepts and think about how each of those ideas may work for you. If you can't get a family into a 1,600 square foot house, if they were going to do a 5,000 square foot house, can you get them into a 4,000 square foot house? That's a win. That's, things like that are ways to use the Pretty Good House framework to do better houses. They're not houses that are going to save the planet the way others might be doing, but there are ways to do a lot better than than the standard on the market.
So we do have one more question from Doug Horgan. Mike, he's asking, with updated passive house requirements, do you find there's much space between Pretty Good House levels and passive house?
Yeah, so I'm trained in the international passive house, and so FIAS, the US version, is although it's supposed to be easier and more accessible, it's confusing to me because it's different in enough key ways. So really, I don't have enough information to answer that.
All right, I think that's about all the questions.